BBC Radio Wales. Ellis Thursfield, Head of Employment Law at Gamlin Solicitors, is in North Wales and is here to guide us through the changes and answer your questions on employment law as well. Welcome back. Happy New Year. How are you?
Happy New Year, Banaz. I'm really well. How are you?
I'm very well as well, thank you. It seems that, things are going back on track now with alert level 0 here in Wales. I wanted to ask you what that means for employers and employees as we go into this new phase.
I mean, what we're sort of hearing is, it's the baby steps back to normality, that we're starting to see a turn back towards, people returning to the office and getting a bit more back to what it was like almost 2 years ago. And actually just over the border in England at 2:00, the Prime Minister announced that working from home guidance has ended in England as from today. So we might see the same reflected in Wales.
Because there's an announcement on Friday, isn't it? So we'll have a better understanding of what is going to happen. So we will return to the office, or we are within our rights to request a flexible working pattern. Tell us how things are looking as we're coming out the other side.
So, I mean, people tend to be quite split. There's the people who absolutely love working from home. It works really well for them. They get a much better work-life balance. And then there's those who hate it. They miss the buzz of the office. They miss those water cooler moments. And
there's no buzz in the office, I tell you that. There's nobody here. But I know what you mean. Sorry.
Yeah, so for those who want to go back, obviously it's not going to be an issue, but what we are seeing, and increasingly what we're getting calls about, is I don't want to go back to normal. I don't want to stay home all the time. I perhaps want a bit of hybrid working. How do I approach this with my employer and what are my rights? So that's what we're sort of hearing. As you know, we're sort of getting towards those more normal stages that we're expecting. In terms of people's rights, just because they've been working at home during the pandemic doesn't automatically give them that right. If their employer pulls them back in, they're probably going to have to comply. But if they put in a formal request to change their working pattern or, their working location, then the employer has to deal with that reasonably. If it's a flexible working request, so if we're changing hours, there's only specific reasons that an employer is able to refuse that flexible working request. So it's not that straightforward. There's processes that need to be followed, and I think we're going to see lots of it.
So have you spoken to employers? I mean, what are they thinking? I mean, is it kind of suit most businesses to have people who can work from home a little bit?
Yeah, we're seeing some that are very proactive. They've already initiated hybrid working policies. They've really thought ahead. They've engaged with their staff. And it's something that's been quite popular because it's meant some have been able to downsize offices, so they've been able to reduce costs. And actually, they've got more engaged and happy employees, and they're seeing the benefits of that. Sickness rates are down, and, they're finding that generally people are a bit happier because they've got that work-life balance. But that's not to say that all employers are doing that. We're still seeing some that are essentially going to need dragging into the modern age, who just don't think anything other than office working can work for their businesses.
Yeah.
And that, they've seen this as almost like wartime footing. It's been emergency measures and they can't wait to get back to normal.
Yeah, from the little that I've seen from people, they all seem to be working harder at home and they seem to be happier, which is what you'd want if you're employing anybody. Now, there is news in the past week or so about IKEA and Next cutting sick pay for unvaccinated employees who have to self-isolate. I mean, what are our rights regarding sick pay?
So what they're doing is, if you are a close contact of someone who's got COVID, so if you've been pinged, that was a new word that we got out of 2021.
Yeah.
If you've been pinged as a close contact and you're not vaccinated, those are the people who aren't going to get the discretionary company sick pay. If someone tests positive for COVID, they have clarified that those people will get sick pay. So with Next and IKEA, and I think it's also Morrison's and Wessex Water as well, what they're saying is, well, look, if you're normally off sick, you don't just get SSP, there's an enhancement, so they might even get their full rate of pay whilst they're off sick. For those people who are unvaccinated, who have been pinged, they'll drop down to statutory sick pay, so they're only going to get the £98 a week, which for some people is going to be a big hit.
And do the employers have a right to demand you to be double jabbed or lose benefits? I mean, surely there are rights for people who are not.
Yeah, so if they were going to mandate double vaccination, employers are going to have some difficulty with that. They'd have to be able to show that they've done a risk assessment, identified this real sort of danger pinch point, and that the only way of dealing with that is for everyone to be double vaccinated. Now, with the steps that we've got in terms of social distancing, sanitizing, PPE, those risks can be managed. Now, if they're not taking the step that they're telling people that you all have to be double vaccinated, and what they're saying instead is, well, actually, if you were double vaccinated and you're pinged, you can go about your life as normal, you can come into work, we're not going to suffer a staffing crisis or reduction in available resources. But this is your decision. You've decided not to get vaccinated, so actually, why should the company suffer? Why should your colleagues suffer? And you should, and essentially pay the price with your sick pay. That seems to be the stance they're taking, rather than mandating vaccination.
There are a fair few people who are exempt from having the vaccine. What are the rights for them?
So if someone's exempt and the employer sort of steamrollers over that anyway and says, no, this is still going to apply to you, then the chances are that's going to be discriminatory. The people who are exempt, they're often suffering from very serious conditions and illnesses, so they would be caught by the Equality Act as disabled people, and it could potentially be classed as unfair or detrimental treatment, so they could potentially have a discrimination claim. What we're seeing from IKEA and Next is that they're saying they'll take it on a case-by-case basis, and if there is someone who's got an exemption, then they may well get their full sick pay.
Good to know. Thank you very much. Now, we heard from our travel expert, Simon Calder, yesterday about how the travel industry is slowly getting back to, I hate saying this, a new normal, with the surge in demand for French skiing holidays. I mean, what are our rights when it comes to leave?
So everybody's got the right to annual leave. The right to when you actually take it isn't that straightforward. So you can't just announce to your employer, I'm off on holiday next week, don't expect me in. It has to be with their agreement. And actually, they can mandate when you take your leave in accordance with the needs of the business. So with the French ski resorts reopening, I cancelled a holiday in the new year. I won't be rushing to go away next week because I can't drop my employer in it like that. But we are seeing lots of people wanting to do that and wanting to dash across the border and go and get out to the Alps.
So I'm assuming a lot of employers in the same workplace will want to take their leave at the same time, because maybe some people haven't been away for about 2 years. I mean, how does it work? Is it a case of a first come, first served basis?
Yes, and it's actually not a new issue. It's something that you see, every year in workplaces. There's sometimes the same characters every year. So, they're up at midnight when the new annual leave calendars are opened or released, and they're in there booking all their holidays to make sure they can be off with their kids. What we're seeing this year is it's almost compounded or multiplied by 100, because you've got everyone who wants to be off. They've not been abroad for a couple of years. Everyone likes to be off with their kids and taking them away. So you are going to see, potentially disputes at work about it. Some workplaces it's first come, first served. Other policies, you may find that they'll judge the applications or the requests on their merits. So who was told yes last time, or who hasn't been able to go away for a while, and actually there can be discussion around it.
I find the organised people always get the best leave time. Where I am, but I am a bit more last minute myself. But say you decide, right, I found a bargain, you book it tonight, and then you come into work tomorrow and they say you can't have it off, but you've booked it anyway. I mean, what if you go on holiday anyway and not wait and not get confirmation that you can go?
The chances are that's going to be classed as you being AWOL, or you're absent without authorization. Most, I'd say 99% of annual leave or holiday policies do dictate that you need to get your employer's permission before you book and pay for a holiday. Because if your employer says no, you can't go. You can't claim that money back from your employer. If you don't go on holiday, you're going to lose that money. If you go anyway, you could face disciplinary action when you get back. And, it takes the spontaneity out of life. We all love, a deal. Everyone, would love to be able to just turn up at the airport and go, where shall I go tomorrow? But unfortunately, when you're not working for yourself and you work for an employer, life doesn't work like that.
So basically, I normally book my leave outside the school. No, when the school term is on, because I don't have any children. But if you have children, I mean, are you entitled to leave during a school holidays? I mean, could it be a case of, okay, this person has children, they get priority over you? Who doesn't?
That could be an approach that HR or whoever manages the holiday calendar will take. All an employer has to do is be reasonable in the way that they're treating their employees. So what you often find is that parents will use their annual leave to manage childcare arrangements in the holidays, because with the schools closed and if they've got small ones, then childcare can be an issue. So often you find they're not going abroad. It's not that they're flitting off to Florida or something for a couple of weeks. It's simply because they've got childcare considerations, and sometimes that is prioritised by employers, and whether that's the right or wrong thing to do, it's a difficult argument to combat, really, when you think about the motivations as to why people are trying to book that time off.
Yeah, so I guess they just have to look at it and find the fairest possible way and try and get everybody understand as to why they've made the decision. Now, can you demand from your employer that, can they demand from you to cancel a booked holiday if it's a case of, okay, things have changed and we don't have enough cover for your job, so can you cancel?
If it's already been authorised and you've booked a holiday off the back of that, the employer is going to be on very thin ice if they try and cancel that leave. So often what your contract of employment will say is, you have to request authorisation to take your leave. If you've done that and you've followed your contract of employment and then the employer demands you cancel it, that could potentially be a breach of contract. And you've got financial losses. You could well lose the cost of your holiday, or you could have an argument that's a breach of trust and confidence in your employer. So how could you possibly trust, when they give you authorization in the future, that they'll follow through on that? So our advice to employers would be, unless it is dire and there's no other alternative, it should be a last resort.
And what about weddings and funerals? Do they count as compassionate leave, or do you need to book annual leave for those?
So again, generally it's annual leave. So for funerals, if your company has got a compassionate leave policy, that may well cover funerals. If not, it's either annual leave or ask if you can take unpaid leave. So with weddings, you can tend to plan ahead a little bit in advance. Funerals, obviously, by the nature of them, tend to be a little bit more last minute. So what that requires is a bit more level of understanding from the employer in terms of why you're taking that time off. However, again, there's no obligation to agree to that time off or to agree to paid time off. But an employer would seem very unreasonable if someone lost a parent, a partner, a sibling or a child not to allow that person to go to that funeral. Again, that could potentially be a breach of trust and confidence, and the employer could face a constructive dismissal claim for refusing requests such as that.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of cancellations in terms of holidays over the last 2 years. If your holiday's cancelled, can you just say, can I cancel my leave and come back to work?
You can make that request, but the employer doesn't have to agree. And actually, a lot of advice that we've been given to businesses is you've got 2 years of annual leave that's been stacking up here. The COVID regulations meant that annual leave could be carried over, so that people who couldn't use it in that real sort of crunch year of 2020 would have 2 years to use that leave. Yeah. Now, for employers that have allowed that to happen, in this year, 2022, you could well have employees that don't just have, their basic 28 days of holiday entitlement, but they've actually got 40, 60 days stacked up. Wow. And you could be looking at weeks without staff and then struggling with cover. And we're already in a bit of a staffing crisis. So where employers aren't sort of overflowing with staff resources, the advice that we're often giving is, if someone's booked it, then, whether they can go away or not, they should be taking that time off, because annual leave isn't for abroad holidays, it's for a break from work, and that can be at home or, somewhere in the UK.
That's a good point. Thank you very much. You are listening to BBC Radio Wales with me, Ben Az, and I'm joined by Alyssa Thursfield, Head of Employment Law at Gamlin Solicitors in North Wales. Now, we were talking about leave before we went to the travel update and the music. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, I've always wondered this. If you become sick or unwell and you've booked a holiday but you can't go, can you ring your employer and say, okay, I'm sick, and for them to change the leave perhaps to sick leave?
Yes, so technically, if you're too poorly to take your annual leave, the law does allow you to take that period at another time. So that would be an instance where you can essentially cancel the leave, you're at home sick, and then you can have those days another time.
Oh, that's very handy to know. I want to talk to you now about personal rights at work, because there was a very interesting case recently about an NHS nurse who has won an employment tribunal battle after being discriminated against for wearing a Christian cross necklace at work. What was going on with this?
So this was a really interesting case. Now, I apologise because I don't know if I'm going to mispronounce the name. So it was Mrs. Onioa, I think, and it was against the Croydon Health Services. And essentially, she wore a small gold cross that was visible. So regardless of, what scrub she was wearing, this cross was visible. It was worn very close to her neck, so it didn't really dangle if she was leaning over a patient. And what she said was, look, there's very low infection risk. It was never going to touch someone if she bent over them. And that actually other staff members wore jewellery. They wore other items that sort of showcase their faith, but it was only her that was disciplined, and it was only her that was focused on. She was successful with the claim. It's a very lengthy judgment, but essentially what wasn't lost on the judge at all was that this uniform and jewellery policy that the health service said they had was not enforced at all. There was an audit done, and there were, sort of between 15 and 25 instances of other staff members wearing jewellery, wearing dangling jewellery, wearing ties that would dangle down, and they weren't disciplined. It wasn't even mentioned to them. But this lady was disciplined for wearing her cross.
So was it a case of you just had to wait, looking at it, it seemed they were just being unfair to her because there was other people. So now maybe they need to put it into place. Either everybody doesn't wear anything, or you are allowed to wear things that don't get in the way.
Yeah, so what we saw in the case was that they brought in an expert at the time who concluded that the cross carried very minimal infection risk, and essentially that was an overreaction, and that when they looked at the audit that this lady had done, where she'd showed all these other examples of people wearing jewellery, that they said that the policy was going to be strictly enforced going forward. But that didn't fix the behaviour in terms of what they'd already done to this lady, and they actually continued with the disciplinary processes. They continued making findings against her, despite the fact that she had very good evidence of other people breaching the jewellery and uniform policy. And what that policy said was, you can wear a plain wedding ring, you can wear plain stud earrings, but you shouldn't wear anything with stones or anything that dangles. And she had examples of people wearing rings with stones, an anaesthetist who wore dangly earrings and a long pendant necklace, and they were permitted in surgery. And actually this lady, she was taken off her surgical duties and she was moved on to essentially a reception desk.
Wow.
So the treatment, it was really, really poor, but the fundamental basis is that she was singled out. And what she said was that the necklace was a manifestation of her faith. It wasn't just jewellery to her, and that she was saying because of that religious belief and how she wanted to manifest that belief, that it was discrimination.
And what are your rights when it comes to personal appearances and beliefs?
So it depends on the setting that you're working in. So with that example, what the health service was saying was it was all around infection risk, or the risk that a patient could perhaps grab something and it would put someone at risk. So in those settings, you can be relatively strict. If you're going to be strict, you need to be consistent on how it's enforced. However, if you're someone who perhaps works in a back office, you never see clients, and essentially, you're working away in almost like a box room somewhere, does it really matter what you wear? Now, employers can have uniform or clothing or appearance policies, but they should not be discriminatory. And what we are seeing is people are moving from working from home back and moving back into the office, and particularly what we're seeing in the modern sort of society is that people want to express themselves more, they want to show their individuality more. So we are seeing some workplaces relaxing those dress codes a little bit. Where we sort of see them bottom out is that, you can't wear offensive slogans or anything that, might be unsafe in the workplace. So if you're working with machinery, you shouldn't be wearing, anything that's dangling or threads or anything that could cause, clothing to be sucked into machinery or something like that. Those are sort of where we're seeing the absolute lines being drawn, but we are seeing them being relaxed more and more. That being said, I think if I turned up to tribunal in a Hawaiian shirt, I'd probably get sent home.
That is true. That is a good point. As ever, you've been very informative. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you. Have a gorgeous afternoon.
You too.